Hey everyone, today I have 10 sound design tips for you. Starting off with this project over here where there's a few different things that I want to show you. Let's focus on this area over here. And one of the things that really makes this part of the production work is all of those rising effects. And a lot of them come from frequency shifters. So if I go into this part over here, this is a recording, which I believe coming from over here. But if we go down in here, you can see that the original idea is this. And then you can hear that delay tail that then just goes rising, rises ever more and more. And that is due to the frequency shifter, which we can see over here. The way that I've been thinking about it is when it comes to shifting things upwards or downwards, when you want to maintain the tonality of a sound, you would use a pitch shifter. And if you don't want to maintain the tonality of the sound, if you deliberately want to disturb that tonality to get more of a rising or downlifting effect, depending on how you use it, of course, then you would use something like a frequency shifter. That is because when you use a frequency shifter, the harmonics that are being used are all being shifted upwards by the same amount of frequency. And because harmonics are multiples of a frequency, that means that they're going to be out of tune with each other. That is why we get this really dissonant feeling towards the end here. It is literally the harmonics that make up the sounds that were previously in balance. And when I say in balance, that means that it has a nice harmonic sound. They're getting kind of pushed out of that more and more as it's rising up. And of course, that is a way that you can grab the attention because that dissonance is something that really stands out. Now, the second tip is going to be a different rising effect, which I also really like, which is this one over here. Now you can see there's actually a frequency shifter involved in the sound, and I am actually using it on the vocal itself, but you can hear that rising effect was happening after it, and that is coming from the delay, which we see at the end here. The whole idea of this delay is that we have a delay set up. In this case, we have it set up so that it just captures this part over here and delays it on up until this point here where the fill is going to be. So you can see that this is an area of the fill where there's like a drum fill, and we don't want to kind of disrupt that drum fill with this effect. But the main idea is that, as you can see, the timing while it's delaying is actually going down. So we start at 212 milliseconds and it goes down to 6.87 milliseconds. Now, of course, these exact values don't really matter, but what you can basically imagine is that it is going to take whatever you have set as your delay size, and it's just going to pitch up in order to accommodate the sound kind of needing to sit in a smaller area of milliseconds. Now, what is cool with these two rising effects is when you kind of combine them, and what you'll see throughout this track is that there's different sounds. So, for example, I believe this one is one with a frequency shifter on it, which you can see up here. This one may also have a frequency shifter on it. This is actually a pitch shifter by the look of things. So you can see another shifting effect with another different tonality and another different way of making the sound shift up. But if I scroll far enough up and down, what we will probably also see is maybe a high pass that is being automated. I actually found a really good example over here, which is this main ARP. As you can see, there's a lot of different automations going on this. But one of the ones that makes it rise up is the fact that, as you can see over here, the frequency of this high-pass filter is going up. So we're going to go more and more into the higher frequencies. And again, this is just a small portion of the track. As you can see, there's multiple sounds in here as well. But the very cool thing that you can do is, of course, combine all of these effects, not just on the same sound, but on multiple different sounds, and kind of rise all of the sounds together into one central point, which is exactly what I'm doing in parts of the track like this one. The next thing that I want to talk about is recording, cutting, and rearranging. When it comes to that stuff, that is something that I do all the time. Here's a good example of that. We had two patches here. I don't know exactly what these were doing, but let's just have a listen. Fairly interesting stuff, I would say. Anyway, what I ended up doing was recording that into a file here, which you can see has some extra processing on it. So it now sounds like this. This is part of the same riser parts that we talked about in the last tip, so this is also helping with the rising up. And then we recorded that again and added a whole bunch of other extra effects, so make it sound like this. And the cool thing here, the cool takeaway is that what I've essentially done now is I've divided up this whole process of first creating this whole patch over here, and then doing all of this processing, and then doing all of this processing into 3 easy steps. And what that means is that I could potentially use this version of the sound somewhere else. I could maybe go back and change some of the starting sounds and then re-render it and maybe get a completely different vibe out of it. But because I'm recording things to audio, I can also take the ideas that I have and maybe rearrange them or change some of the volumes if I need to. That is actually something that I want to get into in a different part, which we can do, for example. I guess this is a good example of that. I don't know if I did any changes to the volume here, but what we have is we have a few different effects. The main one is this sword thing here. So you can hear that comes with a little bit of delay and reverb. And what I did is I recorded a little bit of that delay and reverb, and then I put that on a different track so that I can then go into 1/4 notes with the rhythm and then eventually into 1/8 notes. And then I also recorded some reverse reverbs. That one and this one. And as you can imagine, these are nice to actually slide into the sound. But what you can see is I'm able to rearrange different things, and basically I'm using multiple tracks here to do multiple different things to the sound. Of course, this sound is doing something else in terms of its processing on it than the original sound is over here, and therefore it is going to sound slightly different. But within the track, and with all of the details playing and all of that kind of stuff, you can still hear that it's one singular idea of this sword sound playing, and it then doubling in rhythm and doubling in rhythm again. We talked about volume. Here we have another example of that. I believe we talked about this sound before as well in the video. But what you can see is that I have a clip over here, and I can change the volume of each individual clip and then crossfade between different volumes to get the exact volume kind of envelope to the sounds that I'm actually after. One of the things I've actually found using this technique is that when you take a sound that you're really designing as a background sound, and maybe it's like a little bit glitched up or whatever, or it's a little bit random, what can happen is that you can take a very small snippet of that background sound and kind of boost it in level enough, and then add a little bit of delay and reverb usually to get a nice one-shot out of it. I don't think I have any exact examples of that in this production over here. I would need to go into another production in order to find that, but I do believe that there's some cool atmospheres that you may be able to sample in here. That kind of stuff. So let's just say that we record that. Just take a little part of that recording, maybe half a bar. We're going to go into my one-shots group for organization. And what I can do is I can just drop it on a track where I want it. I'm just going to boost the volume a little bit over here. What we'll probably need to do is remove some of the lower frequencies. I can already see a little bit of rumble just existing in the waveform. Maybe let's add a bit of saturation to generate a few extra high frequencies. Maybe something like that. We'll add delay and reverb, going with Echo Boy Jr. And I want a little bit of a muffled delay sound. I think for an intro that is going to be nice. So I'm going to go with the memory category here. And then we'll just go 1/8 dotted. And then reverb. I'm thinking of like a middle-sized room here for this one. Like this, which is like 1.5 seconds maybe. That's sounding nice. And now you can hear this sounding like a one-shot. And as you can imagine, I'll probably need to do that once or twice more in order for this intro to be actually full with the one-shots that I want. But you can hear that just taking that atmosphere, kind of boosting it a little bit, distorting it a little bit, making it a little bit more interesting, and then adding your delay and reverb can create some really cool instant one-shots. The next thing that I want to talk about is a little bit more specific to atmospheres, and that is the idea with atmospheres that you can use them to kind of write melodies. In this case, this is still randomized. So you can hear we have this cool like sine-esque plug. It is actually made with a triangle and a little bit of pitch shift here. If you want to see the full sound design of this one, there's actually a separate video that I did on a whole bunch of different atmospheres, including this one. But the whole idea is that we're basically spiking out an individual frequency area with this really resonant bandpass over here. And then we're just completely drowning that both in the chorus here, as well as in the delay and the reverb. And the cool thing is that means that the reverb kind of becomes the essence of the instrument. And what I've noticed with that is, of course, it is really, really good for atmospheres, but also because this is random and because of the way that I work, I essentially get myself, 10 different versions of my track before I'm actually finished with the production. It has to do with the way that when I'm downloading them on my phone, the way that it stores them and the way that it creates new files every time. What that means is that I get 10 versions of the track that I essentially can listen through over and over again in order to see which variations of the randomness that this patch is using is the nicest. And then I can go back into this patch and adapt it so that it doesn't use randomness anymore. As you can see, we have the randomness set up as our filter cutoff. I can set that to a macro instead. And then I could write in for each individual sound the exact tonality that I want, therefore kind of writing out a melody with the reverb of this atmosphere. The next tip is going to revolve around complexity. When it comes to a lot of your synth sounds, what you'll find is that there's a nice balance usually between very simple synths and very complex synths. And one of the things that I like to do from time to time is just really dive into a synth to see if I can get the most out of it. So this is a good example of that. You can see there's some crazy automations going on. It's also changing from time to time in what the automation is actually doing. As you can see, there's automations that just kind of start at the halfway point. But you can also see that there's some really crazy stuff that I've just drawn in for this particular sound. And that results in the sound that sounds like this. So you can hear we have some phaser action, we have some flanger action. If we actually go into the patch, you can see even in the patch itself, it's not actually too crazy what it's doing. But we are using all 4 of the macros and have set up modulations for all of them. That is actually what allows me to change the sound from time to time. And of course, those are also the parameters that we're automating here. The main thing though is that I do this for, I would say maybe 1 or 2 sounds per track where I really dive in and try to get a very, very complex sound out of it. For other sounds, what I usually do is I sit back a little bit more. I have a few like simpler ideas in there. Especially with background elements, it tends to be the case that when you make them overly complex, they kind of demand too much like attention within the mix, within the track, and therefore it becomes hard to actually use them for the purpose that you want them to. So say that you're working on the background sound and you're doing a whole bunch of different crazy sound design. The sound design is becoming so overwhelming that it's going to be hard for the listener to follow it, especially if there's going to be like another main idea on top of it. But one of the cool things about this sound, for example, is that it kind of transitions between a background sound into a main sound over here. So if I just play like a small portion here, you can kind of hear that there's other sounds on top of this. There's a lot of different groove things going on over here. And then when we get into the new section, you can hear that the flanger comes in and that really starts kind of grabbing your attention a little bit more. And that transforms the sound a little bit more into a foreground sound. This is going to be an area of the track where I also can afford myself a little bit more space because I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the one-shots as opposed to the sequences. As you can see, there's some other sequences still playing, but you can obviously see that there's a lot more things going on over here. And you can already see that we've started to add the first few one-shots that need to be part of this particular production. So I guess to recap this tip, what I would say is that you're essentially kind of calculating the complexity of the sound that you want based on the role that the sound needs to have within the track. Of course, at the end of the day, that is no different from any other property that you need to think about when you're sound designing. a particular sound. You can imagine that basically any decision that you're going to be making in sound design is going to be reflective of some sort of functionality of the sound in the track. So if you want an aggressive, distorted sound, it is probably going to be a foreground sound. If you want a little bit more of a lusher background sound, you're probably going to make different choices in terms of the sound design than overly distorting the sound. That, by the way, doesn't mean that you cannot get a background sound that is also very distorted, but there's like extra tricks that you then have to do in order to make that distortion actually work as a background sound. And the same can be true for complexity. At the end of the day, this particle sound is relatively complex even in this part of the track. There's still the phaser going on top of it. I believe there's like a secondary flanger even. Okay, no, so the flanger is still the main flanger over here, but you can see we have a phaser. We have some other effects going on. Let me quickly see. We have the release changing over time, that is important, and then we have the tonality of the phase disperse changing over time. So there's still a lot more changes happening in the sounds than what I would normally use for my particles. Normally my particles are just like a randomized bandpass, and that is about it, what I do in terms of sound design. And that is because I deliberately want to keep those sounds a little bit more simple, partially because then I have to spend less time actually working on them and I can spend more time on the actual important parts of my sound design. But also because I know that at the end of the day, when it comes to that sound, I don't want to have a lot of attention drawn to it, and therefore I keep it more simple. Now for this next tip, we're again in a different project, and to be honest, this is one that I haven't really worked on for a while, so I noted this tip down, but I don't remember exactly where I used it. What I've written down is delay to stereo, and I've written it down as being part of track 122. But right now I don't actually find a technique anymore that is being used. What I can say though is that you can think of delay, especially when it's set to a ping pong mode, or when you're using Echo Boy and you have set it to the white mode. Yeah, so in Echo Boy Junior, if you set it to the white mode, meaning that you're going to get a very stereo delay, in both of these cases, what is going to happen is that your delay is probably going to be more stereo than the sound that it's coming from. So you can hear that you sound a little bit more mono at the start of the sound, and then slowly it kind of opens up into the stereo field here. That is something that you can make use of. But another thing that you can do, which is really cool, is say that we want to convert this to a delay that becomes more stereo over time. What we can do is we can group this together. Let's duplicate over this track, and since we duplicate them, we want to set both of them to -6 so that we don't get an increase in volume. For those that don't know, if you have two channels instead of one, you want to lower both channels to -6.02, I believe, in order to get them to be balanced again. So essentially we double the channels over here, and therefore we need to kind of half the sound in a way. So you set it to -6, that will get you roughly close to half the level of the sound, because decibel is a logarithmic scale. But now what that means is that we essentially have two copies of this delay, and what we can do is we can make one of them just normal stereo here, and then we can switch which dry wet is being used. So we'll start off with the stereo one and have that go down over 4 bars, and then over here we'll do the other way around, where it goes up over 4 bars, and now we should transform from a more mono delay into a more stereo delay. You can hear that essentially that effect that we talked about before, where the delay becomes a more stereo version of the original sound, kind of gets drawn out over more and more time. And that, as you can imagine, can be a really interesting way to play with the stereo field, which is often an area where people forget to have fun. Now the next step is going to involve reverse reverbs, which is stuff like this in front of vocals. And you might notice something in this particular reverse reverb that is a little bit strange. Mainly the fact that you can kind of hear it pitching up over time. The way that you can achieve that, say we find ourselves a sound that we want to make a reverse reverb for, say maybe this one over here. Let's find a better sound for this actually. Yes, let's say that we want to take this sound and add a reverse reverb to it. What we're going to do is first of all make another track, and then just on this particular sound I'm going to turn off the delay here, because we don't want the actual delay in there. We just want a reverse reverb. And I'm going to go for a nice big one. In this case, I'm going to go with the square algorithm, which results in very, very long reverbs. Let's set it up to be fully wet and fully late reflections. Let's give it a little bit more length. And let's set the size all the way up. The cool thing that you can do is actually automate the size slowly over time. So let's just have it automate close like this. And you can probably already hear the reverb starts to pitch up. So we can actually use that in our reverse reverb. We go to the track, which takes a little bit of scrolling for me because this is a massive project. But we find the track that we want to record from. And then we just record a little bit of this. Let's go for like 4 bars or something like that. Okay, let's restore the sound to its original state by going like so, and then turning the delay back on. And then we just take this clip here and reverse it in order to get our reverse reverb. But now, of course, our reverse reverb is a lot more interesting. I'm also going to quickly consolidate this. I just like having the waveform at its full size. So we go to 0, and then we compensate here by setting it to -27. Which probably is going to be too quiet for the sound. Yeah, we can turn that up a little bit more. One of the things that I like to do with my reverse reverbs, because the way that you record them kind of cuts them off right when the sound itself is actually playing, I like to kind of fade them out with reverb as well. So I actually add reverb on top of my reverse reverb, which is an interesting idea. But we just go with a medium one. In this case, I can go with something like Stadium, which as you can see is around 4 seconds here, which is just going to give it a nice fade out. And that is just going to help transition into the part where the sound is actually playing. Another tip within the same project, something that I've been doing quite a lot in this project, is actually taking some of my atmospheres and some of my one-shots and other stuff that kind of comes out of nowhere. And as opposed to just kind of having the filter go up over time, like a low-pass filter go up over time, I also have a high-pass filter that doesn't really necessarily go down in frequency. It just starts very low in Q. So you can see over here we have the Q set to the minimum. And then once it's playing up, you can see that the filter actually boosts up into the lower area over here. And that is also true with this next sound here. And that means that even these lowest, like fundamental harmonics are going to fade in a little bit more over time, because that is exactly what this filter is doing. It's not like actually filtering them out. You can see the filter cutoff where the filter becomes really steep. It's actually lower than the harmonics that we're trying to target here. We're just interested in this little movement that you get of this line kind of going up nicely and therefore like slightly boosting them in volume towards the end. And crucially, that means that for a lot of the one-shots and stuff like that, where you kind of want to have that mid-range, but you don't necessarily want that mid-range kind of catching you off guard in a way that it suddenly comes in and that you suddenly get this very strong low fundamental in the mid-range. You don't really want that to happen for a detailed sound like a one-shot, which is just playing in a very small portion of the track. And therefore you can kind of have it smoothly come in over time. So this is a really powerful technique, and all that you have to do is any filter that you're using. Usually what I'll have is I already have a filter to remove any of the lowest frequencies, which is ideal for this. You just go into your one-shot and just draw something like this on the cue. And now it's going to fade in over time. As opposed to something that is just like this. Notice that that lower sweeping sound isn't coming in too much later into the actual sound now. The next idea that I want to talk about is using rhythms in sound that traditionally don't use a rhythm. So for example, these particles over here. These are just your basic sidetrends like particle sounds, and they're just created with some randomness on a bandpass, and in this case it is going through an FM setup. You can see we have a little bit of hyper over here, but nothing like that matters. All that matters is that we're using a little bit of randomness here, both on the filter cutoff and in this case on the FM amount. And that is usually used to add a little bit of an extra rhythmical texture in it, and not in the way that you're actually playing a rhythm, but usually just playing 16 notes. And of course you have your big delay that makes it nice and trippy and whatnot. But what I've done with this one in particular is that I really didn't want that kind of melting together of all of the individual sounds, so you can actually see that the delay is turned off on this one. And then we're actually playing a pattern that makes it a little bit more interesting than just your standard 16 notes. And really the tip here isn't so much to do this kind of stuff all the time, but to do it every once in a while. Like if every particle sound that you put into your track isn't following like 16 notes, it's going to sound odd because we're so used to that. But if every one of your sounds is using the exact same 16 note like pattern, that is also going to be boring because it's just not evolving at all. So sometimes using one, sometimes using the other can make your sounds a lot more interesting. And that is of course something that you definitely need to experiment with. Now this last tip that I want to give you has been my holy grail for this particular production that we see over here. As you can see, when it comes to the amount of sounds in this production, we are at almost 300 tracks here. So this is quite a big project. It's not the biggest that I've ever done, but it's starting to come close. And one of the things that I've noticed when it comes to this production is that the control over the sound is just super important, especially when you're in the production stage. Because of course, everybody knows that when you're mixing that the volume is like very, very important to set the balance right. But also when it comes to the sound design, it is really important to get a feel for the sound. So what I've been doing, every time I sound design something and I don't like the sound, I lower it by 3 dB. And then I adapt it a little bit, see if I like it a little bit more. And then I lower it by 3 dB again. And I lower it by 3 dB until I can no longer hear any of the things that I don't like about the sound. And that is usually the right level for a sound to be at least in the production stage. What that also means is that I usually have a pretty nice balance for me to make changes to the sound, making sure that it's not suddenly going to like fully overpower the track. What I often find myself doing is that I sound design a sound, I set the volume, and then apply one more effect or something like that, and I don't exactly balance for that. And then suddenly, when I render out the sound and I hear it back, say a day later, it is suddenly way too loud or it's suddenly way too quiet. Instead, what I do now is I just sound design something deliberately too loud for the track. So it's definitely going to stand out in the mix. And I will notice that like, hey, this is not right. And then when I'm working it actually into the track, I do this trick of just, okay, do I like the sound? Yes. Okay, leave it. If I don't like it, lower by 3 dB, maybe make some small changes and then I like it. If I don't like it, then I lower it another 3 dB. Until I actually do like the sound and it actually works in the track. Now this of course does mean that the sound needs to work in the track already. It cannot be a type of sound design that just completely doesn't work in the track, that you have to lower it to the point where you can no longer hear the sound entirely for it to work. But say that you're worried about a small detail of a sound here, a small detail of a sound there. Try this trick out, see if just by lowering its volume you can make the problem areas go away while maintaining all of the nice qualities of the sound that you like. And if you can't do that, then maybe you need to adapt the sound a little bit in order to get to a point where you can do that. And what you'll probably find is that your sounds are going to work much nicer in the track. So that's everything that I wanted to cover today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and making sure that you subscribe to the channel. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content. So there will be 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.